Hello and welcome from the Bobsguide studios here in West London. Thanks for joining us today for this great session with Ron Kalifa and Charlotte Crosswell for a behind-the-scenes discussion about the UK Fintech review recently completed that was initially invited by the Chancellor. Today, we'd like to get to the heart of why this matters for the UK and why now. We're in the midst of facing many challenges here in the UK to recover from the pandemic. The FTSE remains at levels lower than pre-lockdown 1. Trade with the EU is dropping since Brexit, and the UK still faces a significant productivity puzzle. On the other hand, the UK has quickly become a fintech leader in recent years, home to more than half of fintech unicorns in Europe. And consumer adoption is growing quickly, accelerated by the consequences of lockdown over the last year. I'm here with Ron and Charlotte, who have been shaping the fintech direction of the country with the government, and I'm delighted to get started. Charlotte, given the many challenges in the UK, why is the fintech review so important right now?
I think if we look at the evolution of fintech, which really started out of the crisis of 2008, where fintech was born, we've seen incredible acceleration over the last 12, 13 years. You then layer on COVID and what's happening there and Brexit, it became this moment in time where we could really seize that opportunity. Now the risk was, if we didn't do anything, people would say, is the UK still attractive? Is it something we want to grow a business, scale a business, hire people or not? And we did see those slight waverings post the Brexit vote, but actually the review was so important because it really showed government's total backing for this sector. We'd already seen that for many years, but I think there was some doubt in the fintech's minds. And as a result of that, it gave us this opportunity, luckily post-COVID, to really look at that and say, how are we addressing fintech? Have we got it the right support mechanism? But most importantly, what's our strategy going forward?
Great, thank you. Ron?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think the reality is that it's such a large sector already. And I think many people think about it as a niche. It's not a niche. It's essentially the future of financial services. So from our point of view, when we started to think about the review, it was all about what's the current size of the revenue pool. It's about £110 billion now. It's going to grow threefold to 380 billion over the next 10 years. And the consequence of all of that growth is that we've got to make sure that we stay in the lead. We've got 10% global market share. And the task is really how do we make sure we carry on growing and not let the strengths of the UK get diluted by others who are actively pushing the agenda as well. So it's a great opportunity, and I think the review's been a catalyst for action as well.
And then thinking about one of the other aspects that you've highlighted as critical to creating the right environment for growing fintechs in the UK and moving to skills and talent. And you have what seem like two sets of perspectives here. One is on making sure that we have the right conditions with the right visas to allow us to access global talent. And on the other hand, you're very strong about ensuring that we need to make sure that we're using things like the Kickstart scheme and working with higher education to make sure that we're also growing our own. What's your perspective? Is one of those more important than the other? Or do they sit right next to each other and become critical, both become critical over time, particularly in the face of Brexit?
I think there's two sides of the same coin, really. One is a short-term issue, because Brexit has actually created more of a challenge in terms of bringing people into the UK, particularly from Europe. And we know that there's a gap in terms of the skills base that we've got in the UK today. So whilst we address that by making sure that the visa stream is introduced and brought in, that's fine. But the second one is to make sure that for the medium term, we start the work now to ensure that we've got the skills that we need for the UK. There's a huge gap in terms of data skills, technology skills, business skills, and that's really needed to ensure that we've got a pipeline for the future. So in many ways, they link together in terms of the recommendations, but we've got to make sure that we keep the oxygen going in the short term so that we've got kind of longevity of the future.
I know you spoke to many market participants as part of the review to make sure you had a full picture. What were some of the issues that they raised and also tactics that they've been employing to try and solve the skills gap in the near term?
They've struggled, but the main thing they were doing pre-Brexit was principally bringing people in from overseas. That's where the challenges were. And that pipeline was a great opportunity for them to carry on growing their business. The challenge has been on the back of Brexit since January of this year. It's a greater challenge. There's a cost, but there's also a time lag in terms of the process that people need to go through. So if I'm offering you a job and you're a coder for the sake of argument in Europe somewhere, but we want to employ you to work in the UK, whether it's in Newcastle or in London, wherever it is, it's probably going to take 8 weeks from the time that you're offered a role to the time that you're accepted onto that. Now, if you're a talented individual, which you will be, you're not going to be hanging around. So that's the opportunity that we've got to make sure that that's why that talent stream, the visa stream, is so important. That's been the main issue that was coming out in terms of skills. That was the first thing that was coming out. The second thing was about capital, in terms of growth capital, which we just talked about. So I think, those have been the two big things that have come through the review.
Yeah, and it doesn't surprise me because that's what I've been hearing. I was running Innovate Finance for 4 years, and these were the two big issues that kept coming up over and over again. People were getting smarter on it. They were putting jobs outside of London. And I think what COVID's shown us is obviously we can all remotely work, and perhaps we are going to get back together to a hybrid system. But how many times now will we see an entrepreneur who does come out of one of those colleges or sixth form or universities around the country and doesn't feel the need to actually go and set up in London anymore? It can actually stay in the ecosystem. It can then employ people from that local ecosystem as well. And if you are headquartered in London, let's encourage more people, we are starting to see this on scaling companies, to be leveraging the talent around the country as well. So we've got to be smart on it. Yes, we obviously will need to bring some talent in until we close that talent gap, but there is already really robust ecosystems around the UK and really robust, very talented people. So we've just got to make it easier and make them understand what fintech's all about.
We're going to get on to the delivery vehicle now, the CFET, and just before I do that, I think it would be sort of remiss of me to not talk about the government's perspective on the FinTech review. And I know you've both spent a lot of time with the Chancellor and Treasury to make sure that this is a public-private partnership, given the complex ecosystem that you've described. Is the government really behind this?
Yeah, look, firstly, they commissioned it. So, and they commissioned it as an independent review. So that meant, Ron, produce it, come up with what you think we should be doing. It wasn't directed by them, it wasn't driven by them. We worked very closely with them through the process because there's no point in coming up with a set of recommendations that they totally sort of reject. So we, spent a lot of time helping them understand the data, understanding the opportunities around it, which they did get. So they were very receptive at the forefront of it in terms of commissioning the work. I think as we went through it, it's been absolutely clear that, literally the day after publication, the Chancellor responded to several things that were in the review positively. He talked about the visas, he talked about the listings. So, many of these things have already been embraced. And he responded at Fintech Week, which was something that Charlotte hosted, 3 weeks ago or something like that. And he gave a keynote speech and talked about the review and, basically endorsed everything that was within it. The ask of government was actually relatively modest. And I was keen to make sure of that. There wasn't any point in asking them coming up with a whole bunch of recommendations that would be sitting on their doorstep because stuff wouldn't get done. They've got too many other things going on. So it was an 80-20 rule. 80% or so is for the private sector. 20% is for the government to address. And government addressing of things will come in two forms. One will be to convene opportunities and convene coalitions to get things moving. The second is to unblock some regulation or regulatory obstacles if they exist. So that's the way that we've thought about it. So that the majority of the work sits nicely and firmly within the framework of CFIT. And that's the way that we've thought about it.
Thinking about we've got a few more minutes, definitely. I know you have a busy day ahead. Just before we come to thinking about the future and looking back on how important this review will have been when we look back, thinking about other obstacles and perhaps the CMA, what are the potential changes and reform that could come about with the CMA to allow this investment life cycle to happen in the way that you envision it? That where you focus on innovation and you focus on innovators being able to stay with their businesses and be incentivized to stay with their businesses and drive forward that innovation, which ultimately drives productivity and is positive for our economy.
Look, I think for any business, doesn't matter what sector it's in, it's about scale principally. And scale is driven by a series of factors. One of them will be M&A, mergers and acquisitions, growing a company through buying another company or combining it in some way. And the rules of today they're prohibitive from a fintech point of view. There's many fintechs that have actually been blocked from growing as a consequence of increasing its scale. And I think we've got to look at that in a much more constructive way. I know that CMA is actually quite forward-looking and understands the challenges, but the problem is that they're shackled by the rules and the regulations that they're operating to. So there's a limit to what they can do. So it does come down to essentially some kind of reform of the regulations to allow small businesses, which they are today, to get to global businesses by buying businesses, joining them up, combining them, and accelerating the growth. So there's going to have to be some change. We can't carry on with the rules staying as they are, because they will stop the UK being a prominent player in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about, if you look at, for a period of fragmentation, you always get a period of consolidation. And we have to make sure we are there as the UK to encourage that consolidation so we can build these global champions. Now, I think a lot of people are looking back and saying, if we looked at big tech 20 years ago, what would we have done differently? And CMA is looking at that, other competition authorities around the world. But we also have to recognise that if fintech is already in a sector of financial services, and there's subsectors and subsectors of those, so the market definition can be very, very narrow, we just have to be careful. If we've got 2 loss-making companies or 3 loss-making companies, they may need to come together to be able to make it a viable proposition. Now, that's a bit of a challenge, because one of the current rules would imply that market definition says you can't come together, but therefore, is that going to mean that those companies die, or worse, get bought out by an overseas competitor who then takes them outside the UK? Because that will reduce competition as well. So I think it's really looking at this sector, like we've seen it with the FCA, and saying, let's look at this and say, what does this mean, and how do we adapt and change to make sure we're not stifling growth or success stories of the future
and losing great success stories in the UK overseas.
Yeah.
And is there any other? There's a question that's come in actually about should regulation be less stringent? Are there any other aspects of regulation? I know it's a topic that you're very close to. Are there any other aspects of regulation that actually could be simpler or more relaxed in order to fuel innovation and bring more fintechs to the UK and have them grow?
I have a strong view on this, that regulation should not be stringent. It isn't about relaxing regulation, it's about making sure regulation is appropriate. There are some aspects which need to be revisited on the back of Brexit, and then the rule book is being revised anyway as a consequence of that, but also in terms of digitisation, and the rule book is being revised around that. But financial market infrastructure rules are changing, but we cannot relax the rules to the point where consumers or SMEs will get damaged. I think it's something that we have been really focused on through the whole review, that regulation is a positive thing for companies and it's a positive thing for society. So there's no question of it in my mind in terms of making sure that it's robust. But it will always have to amend as it does need to, as the ecosystem and as the kind of the processes change in terms of how we are changing our behaviour to cope with technology.
Yeah. I mean, we've always talked about principles-based regulation in the UK rather than rules-based. The problem is when it comes down to when consumers holding their money somewhere, then potentially we need rules-based because people need to understand that their money is safe. So I think that's the challenge the regulators have, is finding that balance between wanting to encourage innovation but making sure that people understand the risks. And how many times have people said, I agree on terms and conditions? We just have to be really careful at finding that level. But we don't want the smaller startup facing the balance sheet requirements of the largest bank either. So it's about finding that proportionate regulation by activity, not by name. But proportionate regulation can sometimes be higher, it can sometimes be lower. It's about finding people that they understand what they're trying to achieve, and they hit that, and then we don't change it along the way so that some of the goalposts move. And I think that's the most important.
Before we go to my closing question for today, as we're nearly up against the clock, what are the things that you're most worried about that won't get done, or that will be the hardest to get done over the coming years, from the recommendations that you've made and the experiences that you've had through talking to all of the market participants, including the government?
I don't think I'm worried that things won't get done. I worry about a lack of focus, which is slightly different. I think many of the things are there to be executed on and progressed. There's a momentum that's built up in the broader fintech sector. No one has turned around and said this is a bad idea. Everyone embraces it. But we have got a market leadership position globally. We have to maintain that for the future of financial services for the UK. And I think we have to think about it in that way, as opposed to anything specific to do with just the fintech sector. I keep repeating it, so forgive me for repeating it again, but the future of fintech isn't about it being a fintech, it's about essentially being in financial services.
Yep. I mean, I think, what worries me is that we just can't get that focus, attention, coordination. It's difficult to coordinate across industry. It's even more difficult to coordinate across government because so many different departments being involved. We are a small country at the end of the day, and when you need to scale, you are going to have to export those products and services nearly always outside the UK. So we've got to help companies on that journey while showing them why they should grow their businesses in the UK and stay headquartered here and get jobs here, etc. And I think that's the thing that's really important. And a lot of people said, do government care about the fintech sector post the Brexit vote? And actually what this review has proven, that they actually do. I think that's been very loud and clear from so many different cabinet ministers. But we have got to be careful that we make it as business friendly as possible, attract more companies to come here, but also really show that they will have to export and expand, and how do we help them on that journey while retaining that thought leadership in fintech across the world.
And when you look, just to come into a close, when you look forward 1 year and 5 years, and you look back on this moment, year 2 post-COVID, a few months post-Brexit, what would make you delighted? What would make you absolutely delighted about all of the hard work that you've put in to putting these recommendations forward?
The recommendations that we put forward included a sentence buried in there somewhere about wanting the government to respond 12 months after the review was published and to stand up and actually give a report card on progress that's been made. Intentionally put in because that's about accountability for all of us. So the first thing is for the government to respond to that in a positive way, and that will be in 12 months, CFIT is set up and running. Several of the initiatives that we have talked about, whether it's about skills, whether it's about investment, there is a path that's defined going forward, and also about levelling up. And then in 5 years' time, what would be really good would be that if we don't use the expression fintech anymore, but we just talk about financial services, that would be success.
Yeah, and I think there's some challenging things put in the review, really saying what does great look like. We're going to have to take those off in bite-sized chunks. Would everyone love to have some form of digital ID in banking? I'm not saying ID cards. Yes, they would. They recognise that would really help people understand the best of how to use their money or business to go and get SME financing. But we're going to have to take that down in small bite-sized things so we can actually show success. So I think when we look back in 12 months' time, we say as a result of the review, as a result of the recommendations, we've moved the dial forward. We've moved it forward national with better coordination, better knowledge. We've moved it forward in some of these coalitions. I think that's what the first year aim is. And in 5 years' time, it's all about embedding it. It's embedding finance and that innovation across the whole of our infrastructure. We're still quite early in the journey on asset management, on insurance. That's going to be also the ones that's going to follow the banking innovation as well. And in 5 years' time, you've got to imagine at the pace of transformation we've seen over the last 15 months, that's only going to accelerate, and we're going to be facing a very different world in 5 years financially.
Thanks so much. Ron, thank you so much for being with us today. Really wish you the best of luck with taking this all forward. Charlotte, thanks so much. Thanks for listening today, and look forward to seeing you again soon.